To Russia now, where Moscow city authorities have threatened prison terms of up to 5 years for people failing to self-isolate in their homes for 2 weeks after visiting countries hit hard by the coronavirus outbreak. Russia has closed most entry points along its 4,200-kilometer border with China, ordering people returning from high-risk areas to self-quarantine. For more on this story, let's cross live to SABC News correspondent in Moscow, Dan Ashby. Dan, a very good morning to you. Russia has announced some very tough measures, and yet it has relatively few cases of coronavirus. What is the thinking there?
Yes, as you say, some extraordinary measures. They have banned all Chinese tourists and students from visiting Russia completely. They have closed much of their land border to China as well. And then we have this announcement that people from Italy, from Iran, arriving from France and Germany, all of them will be forced to undergo 2 weeks of self-isolation or quarantine, irrelevant of whether they're showing symptoms or not. But it's not that has made the headlines. It is the repercussions if people do not obey those rules, because Russia has already passed regulations to say that if you break your self-isolation, you can face a huge fine, up to $1,000, or you could be prosecuted and put in prison for up to 1 year, 5 years if you were to spread the coronavirus and it would go on to kill somebody else. So Russians are looking at this and seeing very tough measures. But at the moment, as you say, only about 15 cases in Russia, 15 or 17, so it is staying very small. But I think the thinking is Russia is trying to act tough and fast before it becomes a major outbreak. It's hoping to stop it coming because it, of course, shares such a big border and such a big relationship with China. So it was much more nervous than other countries when this outbreak started and has acted a bit quicker on some of the bigger issues.
Intervention to jail people is quite interesting when you consider that Iran is releasing prisoners to avoid crowds being in one area at the same time.
Yes, exactly. And it's caused some controversy here when the coronavirus first arrived, those first few cases, because there were people who were being told that they had to self-isolate, to quarantine, they were being kept in medical facilities, and they were complaining that that was against their constitutional rights for freedom of movement when they didn't actually have the coronavirus. So some freedom of speech campaigners, some human rights campaigners have questioned whether these measures are going too far. But at the moment, we haven't actually seen these rules enacted. I think Russia is trying to use them as a deterrent, but even so, some people are critical of that.
Absolutely. Now, these new measures, what are they costing the Russian economy?
Well, unbelievably, the Russian government has already come out and said that they could be losing about $15 million a day in lost trade and costs because of how this is affecting Russia's relationship with China. Because the bigger context here is that Russia is suffering under Western sanctions because it has fallen out with Western Europe and the USA after Russia's annexation of Crimea. And after those sanctions came into place, Russia is trying to pivot east to try build its economic and political relationship with China. So for Moscow to come out and ban nearly all Chinese visitors and close its land border with China was hugely controversial for its relationship with China, and it has led to some complaints from the Chinese embassy here, because Moscow is also racially profiling people to stop certain people and check their documents. The authorities here, the transport authorities and police, are allowed to racially profile people, check whether people are Asian, and if they look like they're of an Asian ethnicity, they're allowed to stop and check them for documents or even raid their hotels to put them into self-isolation. So the Chinese embassy is furious about that. It has complained, and that policy is costing Russia millions of dollars, but it is continuing because it thinks it's the best for public safety.
Then the other global issue that's costing Russia millions of dollars is the oil price wars, a conversation that Russia walked away from at the weekend at an OPEC organized meeting between Russia and China. What is the latest in this regard? This has sent global markets into a tailspin.
Yes, and it's already hitting Russian companies, with Rosneft down on the Russian markets today. Huge plunges on Russian companies on the London Stock Exchange yesterday. And as you say, stock markets everywhere feeling very jittery. But this is, again, it goes back in part to coronavirus. You, of course, are seeing this fall in demand for oil as people move about less, as they travel less, as businesses shut down. And I think Russia was nervous about cutting the supply of oil again to try to raise prices at a time when people are buying less oil. So there was this big falling out with Saudi Arabia. They didn't get an agreement. And then this extraordinary statement from Riyadh saying, look, we're going to effectively go into an oil price war. They're both, Russia and Saudi Arabia are going to try sell as much oil as possible, which sent oil prices plummeting, a record fall. But I think the way that Moscow is now seeing this is that it's going to try weather this storm over the long run to try get a bigger market share. It's trying to push out some American companies who won't be able to survive those record low prices for oil, while using up its national reserves, its savings. Russia has $150 billion saved up from previous oil sales, so it will start to eat into that. But make no mistake, it's going to be painful for Russian oil companies. It will be painful for Russians as their national economy suffers. But there's a bigger game at play here, which is to try get a bigger stake of the market.
Well, I suppose it's a story to watch. Thank you so much for talking to us this morning, Dan Ashby, coming to us from Moscow.